to stand bail. Any to stand bail. The prosecution so strong it was criminal anyone. When the prosecution so strong was prosecution.
When I was first asked to meet with Ian Puddick and write an idea for a short film about a terrible injustice that he'd suffered, I had no idea that this process would reveal the shameful behaviour of those professed to be her guardians, and just how ingrained and corrupt the whole system is. Over the next few minutes we'll show you a summary of that story. Ian, without going into the salacious detail, can you start us off with the discovery of the affair, which unbelievably seems to have been the cause of this whole ridiculous saga?
Well, in May 2009, a text message came through on my partner's phone, and it was a picture of a man masturbating with some sexual content about what had happened the night before. So obviously I approached my wife with the phone, and we discussed it, and it was a very, very difficult time, as you can only imagine. As any guy would, I felt all the emotions that somebody would feel in those circumstances. After a short period of time of reflection, we discussed the matter, and we decided that we would try and work through the issue and see if it was possible to save our marriage.
Anything to do with the City of London rings alarm bells in my head. A self-regulated financial district that seems to be the heart of the present banking crisis. This region is known in journalistic circles as the den of thieves.
In the first instance, if our marriage was to survive, I decided that I would obviously have to, I should say that she would have to move. She couldn't continue to work for the chap that she was having the affair with.
Ian's call to Haynes was met with an arrogant, dismissive tone. I think the phrase was, "Go fuck yourself, it's nothing to do with you." Incensed, Ian then called the chairman of the company, explaining how Haynes had misused his expenses to conduct an affair with his wife. It was now, unbeknown to Ian, that alarm bells started ringing within Haynes's company, and this is when we believe Kroll became involved, and the dirty tricks began. We know this because of discovered emails, where Kroll boasts to Guy Carpenters that they have a contact within the City of London Police. Kroll are a huge security company owned by MMC, the same company who owns Guy Carpenters. And what is more, they share the same offices with their own secret access to each other. Ian was still smarting when a woman called his office pretending to be Haynes's wife.
I started to receive phone calls, several phone calls to my office. All the calls are logged. I also received a call on my mobile phone. And the calls all claim to be from the chap concerned's wife. And there were all these messages asking me to call her as a matter of urgency.
This is Mrs. Haynes.
Mrs. Haynes.
Yeah.
But every time she called, the number that she left was Mr. Haynes's number, and it just didn't ring true that she would keep calling me but leave his number. And it didn't take Einstein to work out that there was something very, very wrong. And thinking about it logically, it was clearly a trap at that time to try and get me to contact Mr. Haynes. And a way of doing that would be I would make that call, innocently thinking I was calling Mrs. Haynes, but the call would have gone to Mr. Haynes, and then they could have claimed whatever. I never made that call, by the way, but I was very, very upset, very, very upset. I was incredibly upset at the time emotionally, as you would expect, because of what happened with my wife. And I don't blame Mr. Haynes, by the way, no more. It's no more his fault than it's my wife. Takes two to tango. But it was a very, very difficult time. And then the fact that they were then trying to set me up for a harassment by getting me or engineering things that would encourage me to call him, I was very, very disappointed. I was extremely upset.
Since Enron, any CEO of a listed Wall Street company found fiddling his expenses is in big trouble under the new SOX law. And more importantly, Guy Carpenter's share price could have been affected. The reason Kroll became involved. They seemed to go to any lengths to protect their share prices. And we all think that's what this whole thing was about. Guy Carpenter's share price. Soon after the calls from Ian to Guy Carpenter's customers, a Detective Constable Dan Valor from the City of London Police visited Ian's wife at work. insisting she'd made the whole thing up. In floods of tears, he continued to bully her, and she was then threatened with perverting the course of justice.
We just didn't have a clue what was going on. The police were just doing all of these things, and none of it made any sense. It was just, as I said, we just didn't know what was going on. The police confirmed that this interview had never taken place. They have no records. They don't know who the officer is. They've checked on their systems. There is no record of any City of London police attending Guy Carpenter's that afternoon to carry out the interview.
Why would the police harass his wife? And why was there no record of this visit at Guy Carpenter's reception? This visit is stringently denied by the City of London Police, but as Michael explains,
well, throughout this investigation, there's such an interesting mixture of fabrication and amnesia. Police don't seem to remember that they interviewed Lena Puddick. They don't seem to remember that they accused her of such a serious offence. And there are no records and there's no accountability. It's similar, actually, to when they pretend that they found drug paraphernalia at Ian's address. Yet the police officer there who makes such a claim forgot to tell any of his colleagues. He also forgot to make his story consistent as he changed it throughout his evidence.
It was about this time that I received a call on my mobile phone. At the time, I just didn't have a clue who it was. And a voice said to me, "You have no idea who you are effing with. We have got deep, deep pockets, and we are going to F you like you've never been effed before." And that call subsequently transpired to come from Benedict Hamilton, who's the managing director of Kroll.
and then someone telephoned Ian's new accountant and informed him that Ian was a convicted drug dealer. All that changed when at 6 o'clock in the morning of the 12th of August 2009, Ian was raided and arrested and appear at Snow Hill Police Station, where he was charged with Section 2 non-violent harassment. He was bailed to appear in court in October, where the magistrate would hear the case and set a date for the trial. After an extremely embarrassing cross-examination of the police by the magistrate, the absurd bail conditions imposed by the police were lifted. This was the beginning of an unbelievable period of lawlessness by Guy Carpenter's, a major American corporation. Firstly, they made an ex parte application for an order by using their lawyers Mishcom de Reer. Mishcom de Reer are one of London's top law firms who represent the Queen, among other establishment figures, sought an order from a High Court Judge Steele to tap Ian's phone and access his bank accounts. This was all done on a totally false prospectus supplied by Kroll. Mishcom de Reer is a highly respected law firm. Sussex Police, to whom Haynes originally complained about Ian's harassment, told Superintendent Chandler of the City of London Police that the offence is not worth taking on. It's not worth doing. At worst, it was a civil offence. But Chandler crashed on, armed with the evidence supplied by Kroll, even though he knew this information was illegally obtained. This case went from a small civil matter into a major operation, costing millions and millions of pounds, and one in which the anti-terror directorate were involved, all on the instructions of an American corporation. Almost every aspect of the prosecution's case is fictitious. Ron Cuffey is an ex-military security officer and an expert witness at Ian's trial. He could probably give us an insider's view as to what was going on. An integral part of the prosecution's case was the harassment of Haynes's neighbours by Ian. The police must have known that was false. I've got Ron Cuffey with me, who is an ex-military security officer and is an expert witness at Ian's trial. Ron, what do you think about this whole business?
Yes, this is quite an interesting part of the evidence, really, because the neighbours claim that a person exactly resembling Ian, they describe him to the T, bearing in mind that most people are very poor at description. This was a classic textbook description of Ian, and of Ian's vehicle. One of them noted the vehicle registration number. They describe a person, Ian, walking up their path to their front door, being abusive to both of them, particularly to Louise Brister.
It wasn't me. I had got a bill. I was 100 miles away at my physiotherapist's having treatment on my back, and I paid on a credit card, and obviously my physiotherapist was able, one, to provide an alibi and actually provide a statement to prove that.
The statements of these witnesses were not signed, and we firmly believe that they never happened.
The statements for this were taken by officers from Kroll, I understand, yet they were typed onto City of London police notepaper, so it looked exactly as if they were police interviews. But one thing you find with a police interview, it always has the name of the interviewing officer at the bottom, and in this case it was missing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I don't think this woman's lying. I think she genuinely saw somebody who looked like Ian, and she genuinely saw a car that looked like Ian's, basically. And what I think they do is they use lookalikes to create confusion, possibly in some cases to create alibis for other people who are doing things wrong. But certainly, I mean, throughout history we've seen this before. I mean, I've actually been researching the Ripper, Jack the Ripper recently, and people have implicated the Duke of Clarence in that, who at the time was second in line to the throne. But when you actually see one of the other suspects, someone called MJ Druitt, they look exactly alike. I've seen photographs of them placed side by side, they look exactly alike. Now, most of us are not expert witnesses. Most people, when they see someone, find it very difficult to pick them out of identity parade again. So that kind of witness evidence in court cases and so on comes with various caveats put in by judges. So you don't need somebody who looks exactly like someone, just someone who looks enough like them. But I understand from the description given by this woman that she didn't totally accurately describe Ian, but nevertheless, someone a bit like him, basically. So that would, again, I would conclude that they're using lookalikes.
Although this case has enormous ramifications in that the state was accusing Ian of terrorist-inspired harassment, but surprisingly the press showed very little interest. We now know that this was because of a campaign of misinformation by the police.
The abuse of power by the police is not nearly as sexy a story as recounting how Ian's wife had an affair with her millionaire boss. It would be unfair to say that the police started a whispering campaign to journalists. They were insistent, they were emphatic, they shouted, they told the story that Ian was a drug dealer. It wasn't a whispering campaign. It was for them to give a completely false picture of the man at the centre of this story.
Part of the problem in getting the press interested has been the elaborate campaign by the City of London Police to give out a false story.
What all the press have picked up is the original claim by DC Mayo that all of these tweets, these thousands of tweets, existed. None of them has reported the fact that she then had to admit they didn't. And all of this, in fact, is completely moot because there is a complete archive, indeed there are two complete archives of all the tweets that have ever been made. So if anybody wants to, or indeed perhaps can be bothered to, they could go to the archive, pull out every tweet that Ian has ever made and analyse them. Then we would know definitively, or everybody else would know definitively because I've done this, whether or not the claims about the thousands of tweets were true. And simply, they're not.
When Ian told his story, the relevant journalists would call the police for their version of events, which, of course, stated that Ian was a major Class A drug dealer and that anti-terrorist directorate were involved. They were involved in terrorist-related harassment. Briefing by the City of London Police, information was supplied by Kroll. Frustrated by the apparent lack of press interest in his story, Ian decided to go to Speaker's Corner to tell anyone interested about his story. But he was being watched and was later rearrested and again charged with Section 2 harassment for reposting a website he'd been told to remove. Released on bail only on condition that he removed this critical website, amounting to state censorship. Then in December, a few months before his trial, Ian was burgled, and the only thing stolen were his court documents.
Can you give me any idea of why the police would get involved in such a grubby affair?
Well, I'd like to be charitable and say that it started well and then it went wrong, but it didn't start well. By searches that they weren't authorised to make, by the way they interviewed Ian, by the way they interviewed his wife. It was rotten from the start. Maybe you have to ask who their real paymasters were, who was directing them. What should have been an impartial investigation turned out to be a campaign against Ian Puddick. As Ian's trial approached, prosecution were bound to disclose material to us. We began to see correspondence, we began to see emails, and sometimes you see the chain of command, and here to my surprise the chain of command had City of London Police under Guy Carpenter, the reinsurance company that employed Tim Haynes, and above them all appeared to be Kroll directing the investigation, emphasising what was in their interest rather than what was in the public interest, and certainly none of this was in Ian Puddick's interest.
At a recent IPCC hearing into the perjury allegations brought by Ian Puddick against DS Ellis regarding the detective sergeant's sudden revelations in court that after floundering while under cross-examination in the witness box, he suddenly proclaimed that during the armed raid some 2 years earlier, he'd remembered finding large quantities of Class A drugs all over Ian's property, as well as the necessary paraphernalia, including an artwork by Damien Hirst, but had forgotten to tell anyone or to confiscate any of these drugs. Everyone in court knew that he'd just invented the story to ease his discomfort. But instead of questioning this blatantly obvious case of perjury, the magistrate dismissed the prosecution's case. And this was the third time this policeman had changed his sworn testimony, perjuring himself on each occasion. But possibly the most worrying and sinister aspect of this policeman's testimony is his knowledge of the Hirst artwork seen in Ian's house, which was actually purchased nearly a year after the raid. It wasn't there when he led the raid.
To summarise, clearly not all policemen are corrupt, but until we find a way of holding the dishonest ones to account, it will continue to sour their image. Ian's case is a microcosm of all the problems that face our daily lives. The internet, and particularly WikiLeaks, have revealed the excesses perpetrated by the American establishment and the illusion of superiority that contaminates that section of society. There is a total lack of accountability from these huge American security companies who have an unhealthy influence over our police forces. There is a total lack of morality among these companies, and the corrupt policemen that can make our lives so intolerable are merely willing foot soldiers doing their master's bidding. Since we first showed this film, several policemen have been suspended and a superintendent at the City of London Police has resigned, including the superintendent that authorised Ian's raid. But as in all other cases, whether it's corruption over the News International story, the disgusting case of the Hillsborough case, or as in Ian's case, the officers involved simply resign, receive a lump sum for early retirement, and then head for their houses in the country on a generous state pension, or as in many cases, become employees of Kroll. Even though there is abundant proof of wrongdoing, and in Ian's case, clear proof of perjury and the perversion of the legal process, an offence for which you and I, as mere mortals, would pay dearly, we'd go to prison. We've reported these bent coppers to the IPCC, as shown in the updated Operation Bohan film mentioned earlier, but I must show you this latest document we received to illustrate the ineptitude of the IPCC, where they have stated that DS Ellis, who was behind this whole problem, followed all the correct lines of procedure. Need I say more? And for the rest of us, there are few more painful and disturbing events in life than a policeman in uniform telling blatant lies in court. We must put a stop to this. Our lawmakers, our politicians are responsible for this mess. They have allowed the American corporations to ride roughshod over our cherished institutions, and they have politicised our police forces. The likes of Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair and their sycophantic cohorts have sold us down the river for personal gain. The only way to restore trust is to stand up for British citizens and to do it in a transparent way, and to punish those who commit crimes, no matter what their class or status or how much money they've got. We recently received support from an unexpected quarter. The anonymous movement, which I hold in great esteem, took the surprise step of hacking into Ian's website and leaving the clear and concise message to anyone found tampering with his website would receive the full attention of the anonymous movement.